Hey everyone, this is Alan Fire back with a new action-packed ActionVFX tutorial. Okay, so ActionVFX just released these new water splash / explosion elements, and these things are the bomb. Firstly, I'd like you guys to know that this episode isn't specifically about explaining how to create one particular effect or what exact values to put into each setting and all that stuff. What I'd actually like to do is try to get you guys familiar and comfortable with approaching somewhat advanced stock footage composite shots, namely WaterFX projects. So I think it's important to let you guys know clearly what we'll be covering. Ultimately, my goal is to explain how you can construct VFX shots like this, and I'll go over how to composite each different type of water explosion, each type of water element from ActionVFX. And while doing so, I'll try to explain useful editing techniques, tricks, and principles that I've picked up from my experience. Alright, so the first thing is tracking. So we've already covered tracking several times in our previous tutorials, and just for the purpose of covering more and more information as we go on with these tutorials, just check out our previous ones to learn all about the tracking. We really like to use the Mocha Pro plugin. Check out the ground crack tutorial. That one covers the process thoroughly. And I'm telling you, this piece of software will pin your tracking like it's nailed to the background motion, position, scale, rotation, all that great stuff. After Effects also has a built-in version of Mocha over here. In the animation tab, you can choose Track in Mocha AE. And of course, we can go to the tracker window in After Effects. Go to Window, Tracker, and choose either Track Camera, which is covered very well in our Atmospheric Fog tutorial, or just do a simple track motion. But in this tutorial, we're going to apply our tracking data to a null object. Okay, so the first step is to find a good spot and time for the splash to happen. A good shot or film action sequence is all about rhythm, and keep note of this principle because it'll be an excellent way of guiding you through your work. The purpose of an action sequence is to be entertaining. Just like music, a good music piece hits the right notes at the right time, has a good rhythm, but we can also think of an action sequence like this as visual music. Visual occurrences happening at the right time with a good rhythm. I'm not at all saying we should do 4/4 timing or anything like that. Action rhythms are a bit different, so they're not necessarily evenly spaced through time like music, but there's still a rhythm involved. Okay, let's see if we can think of a good rhythm for this shot. So, right at the beginning here, we have kind of a significant event, right? This dude comes up, and this would be like a beat in our visual music. So we have zoom, something like that. So that would be a good rhythm, a good beat. So it comes up, and right about 2 seconds is probably when the blast needs to happen. That'll be good. What I like to do is create a marker so we can kind of visually see when that water blast happens. So what you can do is on the keyboard, hold Shift 1, and that's going to create a marker with the label 1 on it. And how it works is you can go forward and do Shift 2, and that's going to create a marker with the label 2 on it. So hopefully you have a much better grasp about timing and how to make the decision for when elements need to come in. So step 2 is finding a good point in space to place the element. So how do we do this? What are some good principles to help us make this decision? Well, the first thing we can do is look for open spaces. So in this shot, we have some action going on over here, but there's a lot of open spaces over here, and that's just ripe for some action to happen there. So we have some good open spaces over here. So why don't we go ahead and drag in a water blast element? Let's look at this one. Why don't we use this one? This one looks good. So let's go back to our composition. Let's drag in that water blast element. And it needs to happen right about where we place that marker. So when I position these elements, what I really recommend is to place the anchor point in the right part of the footage. So what you can do is click on your footage, hit the letter A on the keyboard, and adjust these values so the anchor point is at the center of the explosion, or where the explosion begins, the origin of the explosion. Just like that. And we also want to make sure and parent this element to our tracking data. What are a few more good principles about making the decision for where to place your element in the scene? Well, like I said, open spaces. And also, secondly, we can look for a place that the element blends well in. So for instance, this element might blend a little better if we put it over here, because the color of this element matches the color of the water a little bit better. But we also have to balance that out with our with the other principles. Sometimes it's just a one or the other kind of deal, but we also want to keep both in mind. And thirdly, we need to consider our foreground. Sometimes it's just a good idea to move an element from behind an active foreground element just to make life easier. Alright, you can save a lot of time and work if you just choose a different position for the element to be in. But also, sometimes rotoing elements behind certain foreground objects can contribute to the realism of the shot by helping it blend in better. It helps rid the implication that it's just an overlay effect. See, if we have the foreground, which is completely real, and the background, which is completely real, and we have this element between the foreground and background, obscured by the foreground, it just blends it in, as though it's between, really in 3D space. So that's something that's also good to consider. Hopefully those tips are helpful for finding a good spot to place your element. So now we just need to think about the rotation and scale of this object. We can kind of see the slant of this river here by this line. We want to kind of align this element with that slant. So we can go to our rotation tool or click on the element and hit the letter R on the keyboard. And just kind of rotate this or change the value down here. I use the rotation tool right here. And I just kind of rotate it to match the angle of the camera. And now that we've positioned the anchor point properly, we can now scale the water element by clicking the element, hit S on the keyboard, that opens the scale property, and we can scale this element without changing its position because we have the anchor point in the right spot on the footage. So I'm thinking something like this is the right size. Okay, looking great so far. So the way it's happening in this scene is there's a bomb that falls into the water, creates a splash, and then the explosion happens. And this is the water effects from that explosion. So before this, we need to make a splash where the bomb falls into the water. So let's again think about the rhythm, just like before. Let's say the splash comes in, and then he comes up onto the deck. Splash, up, boom, something like that. So let's do the splash about right here. Let's go to our water splash folder. Let's find a water splash that looks good. This first one looks great. Let's go back to our composition, drag this in. Make the timing just right. In the same way, we want to make the anchor point in the right spot so we can change the size and rotation like that. And we got to make it in the same spot. So let's just drag it forward at first so we can put it in the right spot. You can scale it down. Adjust the rotation. That looks pretty good. And let's apply this to the tracking data. And we'll move this back. So the bomb is actually going to come in this direction. So we want the splash to kind of go in this direction. So it kind of continues the same horizontal vector. So let's just flip this around. Right click, transform, flip horizontal. Like that. Make the rotation right. So the next thing we need to think about is the time remapping or speed of these water elements. Are they too slow? Are they too fast? And usually the bigger the element, the slower it's going to fall relative to the whole size. So the bigger the element is, usually the slower it needs to be. So this element right here is pretty small, so we might need to speed this one up a little bit. So let's right click, go to time stretch, and let's make this about 75. So it's only going to be a 75% as long, which makes it faster. Now let's take a preview of that. Okay, that one looks great. But I think we can slow down this large water blast a little bit. So let's go to time stretch. Let's do like 107. Well, it's just a little bit slower. It makes it look like it's larger. And one big part about finding a good position for the element, finding the right timing, finding good speed, is watching previews. Just trying different things out, take a preview of it, and just make little adjustments to improve. There's no better way to get a feel for what you're creating. Also, one thing that's okay to do is slightly animate these elements. See, here it explodes just in the right place, but then later on it looks like it's a little bit too high and not exactly where the other splash is. So we can do a slight animation and get away with it without people noticing. So right here it looks good, and I'll hit P for position, click the stopwatch to add a keyframe. Let's go forward a little bit and just move it slightly down, just like that. Then we can select both of these keyframes, do an F9 to make it easy ease. No one's going to notice that little animation, but it is a nice adjustment. So in this shot, I'd like to add a splash effect to go along with this water blast. That's going to fill out the base a little bit and add more complexity and dynamic to this water splash. So we can do that. We can mix different water elements. So let's go down here to the water splashes. I'm gonna think this is the element I like. I'm gonna drag this one in here, and let's move it forward in time. Position the anchor point, parent it to the tracking, adjust the timing. I'll scale it down just a little bit. Then I think I'll flip this horizontally. Okay, look at there. Doesn't that seem to help a little bit? I just like how it makes the base of the water splash thicker and adds more dynamics, more motion variation. I really like that. So we don't want the splashes to seem separate. We can see one splash and then we can see another splash here. We want the two splashes to blend better together. So what we can do is actually drag this splash element below the water blast element. And over here on the track mat, if you don't see track mat, toggle switches. You'll see track mat and go down here and do alpha inverted mat. So that's going to make the splash not exist where there's alpha information on the blast. We can turn the blast back on because it automatically turns off. And you can see that you can't really see the splash through the blast element since we did that alpha inverted. It exists where there's not alpha information on the blast element. This is before and this is after. That's a really nice technique. Okay, and along with that splash element, we can see how this is looking a little bit 2D. Like, there should probably be more action going on in front of the element. And we can do the same thing, just keep combining more elements. So you can actually get kind of higher angle splashes, and we can use this to kind of add some 3D to the base of our splash. So here we have this high angle splash in the composition. And what I actually like to do is make this a 3-dimensional layer. So with toggle switches, hit this 3 dimensions icon like that, and then rotate the splash like this because it's a little bit too high of an angle. Make it start just the right time. Parent it to the tracking. See, maybe we can fix the anchor point a little bit and just position it right. See, I want to scale this up a little bit. And you can see there we kind of have some depth to our splash base. And remember, we can tilt this 3D layer more if we need to. And also, the splash doesn't look right, this angle splash. Doesn't really look right because of the 3-dimensional rotation adjustment we made to it. So let's just make it fade in. Let's not have this beginning part. Let's make it fade in, around here. So we'll hit T for opacity, T on the keyboard. Add a keyframe by clicking the stopwatch. Let's move back towards the beginning. Turn the opacity all the way down to 0. And let's select the keyframes, do F9 so they're easy ease, like that. And let's preview how that looks. Okay, it looks a little fast. Let's drag this opacity out further so it's a slower fade in. And I'll actually move this splash element forward in time so it actually comes in when the splash kind of comes back down and hits the water. That looks pretty nice. Okay, and there is one last thing I would like to do. I want to fill out this base a little bit. It looks a little bit thin down here. I just want to fill it out a little bit. So what I can actually do is create a new solid, make it white, hit OK, and parent this to the tracking. Turn the layer off. I'm just going to circle around this base right here. And I can get the mask feather tool. Still not much feather down here, but kind of a lot up here. And just add a little bit of feather to the whole thing. Okay, let's hit M to go to the mask path. Let's add a keyframe and just animate this throughout time. Okay, so something kind of like this. We just want to fill out that base a little bit. So let's turn the layer on. Let's turn the opacity down a good bit, so maybe about 25, like that. Let's add a keyframe to the opacity. And go back in time and keyframe the opacity to be 0 at this point. And let's go here towards the end and just make the opacity fade out back to 0. Okay, that looks pretty great. We got this nice thick base to the splash. Alright, so once you finish the setup and placement geometry of your splash, what we can do is duplicate the tracking, because what we're about to do is pre-compose this whole splash, but we want to leave a copy of the tracking. So let's select all these layers and pick whip the duplicated tracking layer and grab that tracking with all the elements, right click, pre-compose, We'll hit move all attributes. We'll call this bomb splash. And now let's hit OK. So there we go. We got one layer with all of our splash elements in there. And what we're going to do now, and this is a technique that will come useful with lots of other stock footage compositing projects. But what we're going to do is duplicate this bomb splash layer. And we're going to try and make this element look thicker without making it too white or just increasing the alpha values. So we're going to go to the bottom layer of the two, go to Effects and Presets, and type in Tint. We'll apply Tint to this bottom splash layer. And for map white 2, let's choose maybe like the pond watercolor, like that. So we have before and after. So what this is mainly going to do is fill out the splash layer without making it too white. So we can't really see through the splash layer like it's thick. So it adds weight to our splash. And it doesn't necessarily have to be so green, because if you look here towards the beginning, we have a kind of an example of what color the splash should be. So let's not make this so green. Let's make it a little more gray. And also for this top bomb splash, we can tint it as well. And you can see that there's not really any highlights with this log footage, so we can just kind of bring the brightness down. And when we add our final color correction or grade, then it's going to make those colors pop again. Okay, so to me this effect is turning out really good, but there are some very essential adjustments we need to make to help this blend in better. Okay, so the first thing is the camera lens blur. You can see here that the splash is crisp, but the black background or the environment or the 3D position it's in is blurry. So it's very essential with that we add some camera blur to the splash to make it match the blurriness of the footage in that spot in 3D space. And the second thing we're going to do is add a reflection. So let's go ahead and get to the camera blur. To do this, let's just pre-compose these two layers. And let's hit OK. Then we can add a camera lens blur effect to that layer. So camera lens blur, put it on that layer. There we go. Also, it's probably a good idea to be in full resolution so you can get an accurate preview. And remember, this splash is a little bit closer than the background, so it wouldn't quite match the same blurriness. You just want to look at this point right here in 3D space. So yeah, 5 pixels of camera blur seems good. I'm going to go ahead and add a keyframe, and then I'm going to go through this footage and animate the blur radius to match that changing focus of the camera. So I can click on the footage, hit U to open up the keyframe parameters. At this point there should be 0 blurriness. And I'd say right about here is when the camera starts changing focus. So let's add another keyframe, make it 0. And then he looks pretty crisp at this point, so that means the background should be pretty blurry. So let's do about 5. Okay, there's our animation. We're in the graph editor here. We can kind of smooth this out. Let's just choose Auto Bezier like that. And also, it seems that this element, when there's no blurriness, is a little bit more crisp than the footage. So what I like to do is just add an expression to the blur radius. Hold alternate, click the stopwatch, and just type in here plus 0.5. So before the lowest value was 0. And then now that we add that expression, we can view it by clicking this button. The lowest value is going to be 0.5. So it's always going to have at least 0.5 pixels of blurriness, just to kind of match the resolution of the footage, or quality of the footage. Okay, and you can see here that the blurriness really does a lot to the realism of our composite. Okay, so now that second thing, we're talking about reflections. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, we go in here to this bomb splash composition. This is where we have 2 layers of the bomb splash element. One kind of the color of the water and the other one white. And what we're going to do is add an adjustment layer above that. So we're going to call this adjustment layer reflection. So what we do then is add a transform effect to the reflection adjustment layer. And then I'll uncheck uniform scale and I'll turn the scale height to -100. Okay? And how this is going to work is we're going to blend this in with the original by using a CC composite effect. So let's apply this after the transform effect, and just uncheck RGB only. Okay, we've got something going on here. You see the reflection follows the horizontal movement, but the vertical movement is in reverse. So this is going to be tough to fix. How do we fix this? Well, we can access our motion information by this tracking null object. So let me just copy this, Control C, and paste it in here, Control V. And I'm going to open the position parameter. And for this reflection, I'm going to go to the transform anchor point and add an expression to this anchor point. Hold alternate click with stopwatch. So what we're going to do is type in plus, and then we'll do 2 square brackets and a comma in between those brackets. For the left side of the bracket, let's do 0. But for the right side of the bracket, let's choose tracking position Y. And so we have that on the right side of the comma. So now what happens is the anchor point does the opposite of the position, so it's actually canceling out, and there's no vertical motion. There's no vertical motion to this reflection. So, but what we can do is if we multiply this array times 2, then it's not only going to cancel out the opposite motion, but it's going to go beyond that and do the motion that the original splash is doing. Okay, but it might not be in the right position. So what we'll do is we'll have to just change this Y value for the anchor point, and like that. And what we can also do is just add some rotations, a whole control, and then just kind of rotate this a little bit. Look at that, there we go, we got a nice reflection. Okay, so, I mean, this would be cool if our water was like mirror smooth surface, but we're going to have to kind of wiggle this out a little bit to make it look like it's refracting along the bumpy surface of the water. But what we're going to have to do is create a map that kind of matches the texture of the river water. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do this in this composition, then we'll copy it to the other one. So let's create a new solid and hit OK. Let's make this a 3D layer, and let's rotate it like this. And maybe just actually squeeze it down a lot. Okay, we could probably change the anchor point just to move it towards us like this kind of, and just scale the whole thing up. So make it pretty big. Okay, so now what we're going to do is add a fractal noise effect, and we're going to try to match the texture of the water with that fractal noise effect. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is uncheck uniform scale and just maybe turn the height down, maybe kind of like that, and maybe just rotate this a little more in 3D space like this. And I'll bring the complexity down. So complexity right here, let's just bring this down quite a bit. And I want to animate this evolution just to have some movement. So let's hold alternate click with stopwatch. We'll type in time times, say 200. There we go. So hopefully this map will match our water pretty well. So I want to make a duplicate of this tracking and parent this map to the tracking. So let's pre-compose the map with the tracking. Pre-compose, call this water map. And I'll hit Control X to cut, but it on our clipboard it copies it. And we can go into the bomb splash and hit Control V to paste it. Okay, so this map actually follows the motion of the camera, so that works good. So we're going to use this as a displacement map to displace our reflection layer. So let's go to the reflection adjustment layer and type in displacement map. And let's go to the displacement map layer, choose water map, and horizontal displacement can go up. Hopefully you can see what it's doing here. Now we need to put this displacement map before the CC composite, otherwise it'll affect the original splash. Just like that. There we go. So it looks much more like a reflection. And we can probably turn down the opacity of the reflection to maybe something like 65, looking much better. And also we probably want the base of the reflection to be a little bit less displaced, and then as we go down it'd be more. So we can go to the water map. So what we can do in here is create a new solid, just make it gray, because displacement maps do not displace where there's gray. It doesn't match the composition size, that doesn't matter. Let's just scale it up. And then let's just make a mask right at the top here, and then feather it out a good bit. Something like that, and then we'll attach this, we'll parent this gray layer to the tracking. So there you can see there, it's not displacing the bottom much, but as we go up, it does more and more. So maybe we can turn up the displacement a little bit. So there's our reflection. I think it looks pretty nice. Maybe the last thing we'll do to the reflection is add a little bit of blur. So just go to fast blur and put it before the displacement map. Add a little bit of blur. Maybe that helps. Anyway, that's how you can add a reflection. What else? Also motion blur. So let's go into the bomb splash here. So to add motion blur is important. So To add motion blur, we can apply a pixel motion blur. And this is an effect built into After Effects, not a plugin or anything. Works really well. Look at that. Very nice. We could possibly turn the shutter angle up. I think it looks more realistic that way. And so you can see here towards the end that the foreground figure is in front of the layer, and we would have to do some roto work, but we're not going to go over this. This tutorial is already really long, but we have covered rotoing in previous tutorials. But you would definitely want to put these elements behind any foreground subjects or anything. But that's not the topic of this tutorial. Okay, so I would love to end here. We've covered so much information, but there's one last thing I really want to tell you guys. We have to cover all the different elements. We haven't talked about the small water hits. And a lot of this is the same process and techniques for the larger splashes and water elements. But we're going to do this real quick just because there are some differences and there's some useful information that could help you guys out. So what I usually like to do is drag in just several small water hit elements. These were created with bullet hits in mind, but there definitely is a variety of different ways you could use these splashes. So the first thing is important just to position that anchor point properly. Let's just change the anchor point value so it's in the right spots. I hope you guys get the purpose of that anchor point thing. It's so you can scale and rotate the element without changing its position. If the anchor point is the point on the footage that doesn't move. So if you scale it up, all the other points are going to move except that point right there. And the same with the rotation. It rotates around that point. And okay, we want to think about the timing when it needs to come in. So we could do it like after this big splash. You know, this actor is doing different actions and motions. As he gets up, then the bullet hits go by. I'll make him start right about here as he kind of gets up. So let's make them all start right here. And let's say these are machine gun bullet hits. So the time of each layer needs to be offset by about 2 frames, 2 or 3 frames. So I'll just hold control, click that, and it unselects that one. Let's move them forward 2 frames. Do the same thing for this one. I'm not sure how many we'll need. So let's move them all kind of over here and just scale them down. And just start positioning them from first to last. So say here. And make sure and attach them to, or parent them to your tracking null. Okay, that's looking good. But now it's just a matter of making the scale right. These are further away. They need to be smaller. And these right here are closer, so they need to be larger. Scale this one up a good bit. Probably delete that one. Much better. And obviously we have some roto work to do here. And we would go through with all the adjustments we made with this big water splash. We want to go through the color matching, the camera lens blur, the thickening, all that stuff. But the only thing that is kind of different with these splashes are the reflections. So let me just go ahead and show you how we do reflections with these bullet hits, because they are all in different positions and we can't use the same displacement technique. We're going to have to do each of these splashes individually. And it's actually not that tough. Here's how we do it. So basically just duplicate the splash layer and then go to the scale and flip the Y value for the scale. Like that. Another advantage of having the anchor point in the right place. And what we could probably do is turn down the opacity just a little bit. Like that. And then for the displacement, we're actually going to use an effect called turbulent displace. And there's kind of a problem because turbulent displace has more even turbulence as far as the way it's distributed between X and Y. It's not like this horizontal turbulence like we want. But there actually is a way to do kind of horizontal turbulence with turbulent displace. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to get a transform effect. We're going to place this before the turbulent displace. And let's do this scale height 500. So it's really scaled up. But then we're going to add another transform effect after the turbulent displace. And then uncheck uniform scale and do scale height. Then we're going to do, since it was 500, that's 5 times the height. So we're going to divide by 5 to scale it back down to its original size. But when we scale it back down, you see we're going to have this horizontal turbulence. Because we scaled it up here, it added regular turbulence. So it's just regular turbulence, but it scaled up. And then when we scaled it back down, then it squeezed it. So now we have this kind of horizontal turbulence. We'll probably scale it up a little bit to match the water look. So I think that works pretty well. We could probably also add some fast blur to that. I think that's a pretty nice looking reflection. Okay, so that's all for this episode. There was a lot of stuff to cover today. I hope you guys found this useful and worth your time. Why don't we review what we've gone over today? We went over the concept of good rhythm and timing. We talked about how to decide the best places to position your elements, changing the speed of the stock footage. We went over how to combine different elements. We covered how to add dimension to the splash, and how we can manually help fill out the base. We went over thickening the splash and color matching. We talked about adjustments such as camera lens blur and motion blur. We covered how to create realistic water reflections with displacement maps, and then we went a little into compositing small splashes and how we can render reflections of those. So I hope you enjoyed all the knowledge that came along with the creation process of this scene, and perhaps inspired some sweet ideas of your own for how you can use stock footage to enhance your video creations into something stunning. So I've certainly had fun. My name is Alan Fire, and until next time, I'll leave you to it. Thank you.